One of the questions I had when I was getting started in videography and photography, and one of the questions I get asked a lot is, which is best, full frame or APS-C? And today I want to walk you through the strengths and the weaknesses of both so that you can make a decision on which one is going to be the best for you. And it might not be the one that you think it is. Hey, hope you're doing well. My name is Jake Sloan and I create content here on YouTube for solo creators to improve their videography and photography. And so I do tech reviews of equipment that makes that possible and easier. And I do tips and tutorials on how to use that equipment to help you create better content. One of the things that can be super daunting, especially if you're just getting started in videography and photography, is what type of camera to choose. And if you watch lots of videos on YouTube or read lots of articles on the internet, there'll be a lot of people saying you have to go full frame or don't worry about full frame because APS-C is just as good. Which one is going to be best really comes down to your needs and your budget. Let's start off with the strengths of each system. APS-C is a great system because one, the camera bodies are smaller, and I mean a fair bit smaller. Like, they're a lot easier to pack in your bag, they're lighter weight, they're easier to take with you places, and in the case of the Sony A6100, A6400, which I'm shooting on now, and the A6600, they have a flip-up screen so you can see yourself if you're shooting yourself, and like a lot of us on the internet, you probably are. So it's great that the APS-C camera bodies are smaller and lighter weight than their full frame counterparts, but what about the lenses? Well, that's the great thing too, is because the lenses aren't having to cover such a large sensor, they can be much smaller than their full frame counterparts. For example, this is the 16-50 kit lens that you can buy with Sony cameras. This is an incredibly small lens. Now when you turn it on, it does pop out, but this lens is the equivalent of a 24-75 lens on a full frame camera because of something called crop factor. And the crop factor is basically, in a Sony camera, you multiply whatever the focal length is on the lens, aka 16 or 50, times 1.5. So at 16, that ends up being 24 millimeters. At 50, that ends up being 75 millimeters. And that's one of the great things about APS-C cameras is that you can actually extend your camera zoom range because of the crop factor. Because the lenses are smaller and generally lighter weight and don't take as much material to build, that also means generally that they're quite a bit less expensive than full frame cameras, which can be a real help if you're just getting started out and you're looking to invest some money in camera gear. You can invest a lot less and get a very good setup on APS-C cameras than you can if you're going to buy a full frame camera and a few full frame lenses. And that's another great point about APS-C cameras is generally they are a fair amount cheaper than even the lowest cost full frame cameras. For example, if you're going to buy an A6400 right now, you can get one for about $800. Whereas to get the cheapest full frame camera, say an A7RIII, you're going to spend around $1,800 or maybe $1,500 if you buy one used. Which also leads me into that the lenses are generally quite a bit cheaper. I'm shooting this on a Sigma 16 1.4, which is a fantastic lens for APS-C, really sharp, really great, and a nice field of view because it ends up being about 24 millimeters, which is a fairly wide field of view. That lens costs $400, whereas the equivalent lens on a full frame camera would probably cost around $1,200 to $1,400. Now let's talk about the pros of full frame cameras. One that you probably hear a lot about is they're much better in low light, and that is true to a certain extent. They do have lower noise at higher ISO than APS-C cameras. Another thing that used to be a pro, or still is depending on which camera you get, is generally full frame cameras have better battery life because they have bigger batteries. Now, Sony in the A6600 has changed that because they've added essentially the same battery that's in their full frame cameras is now in their APS-C camera. But if you get the A6400 or the A6100, or if you have some of the other APS-C cameras that Sony has produced, then you're going to be using a lot more batteries because the battery life isn't nearly as good as full frame. Something else that full frame bodies have that a lot of APS-C cameras do not have is IBIS, which is in-body image stabilization, which just gives you a little bit more stable image when you're shooting video. And if you're shooting photos, it allows you to shoot at lower shutter speeds so you can let more light in without blurring your photo as much. Now, there's a lot of debate about how well that works, and different camera manufacturers definitely have different takes on it, some of them much better than others. But IBIS is something that generally is only available in the very top tier APS-C camera from Sony, aka the 6500 or the 6600, or the full frame cameras. And then one of the biggest pros probably is the wide field of view. When you put a 16mm lens on a full frame camera, you're seeing the full 16mm, which is really, really wide and really nice. Whereas if you put that 16mm lens on an APS-C camera, you are getting 24mm, which is wide, but not as wide as 16. And so if you really want to get the widest view possible, especially if you're doing landscape shots or tight interior shots, then full frame is really, really nice. Now, you can get equivalent lenses on APS-C cameras now, which you didn't really used to be able to, so it's not as big of a factor as it used to be, but definitely if you're looking to get the widest field of view possible, then full frame is going to be the way you want to go. And that brings me to the last real pro of full frame versus APS-C is the blurry background, or bokeh. And this is a hotly debated topic on YouTube, but in theory, with a low f-stop or a really fast aperture lens like 2.8, 1.8, 1.4, you're going to get a more blurry background which separates your subject from the background than you can on APS-C. There are ways to overcome that, and some of that is just how close you are shooting your subject versus how far away the background is from your subject will make a difference. So now let's talk about some of the cons, some of the downsides of APS-C. In-body image stabilization, Sony at least doesn't put in-body image stabilization in any of their lower tier or mid-tier APS-C cameras. It's only in the very top tier APS-C camera, and even that, it works, it definitely helps, and it definitely makes a difference, but I would argue that it doesn't make that big of a difference for video shooting at least. And this is probably my biggest pet peeve about APS-C cameras, is because I assume because the body sizes are smaller, they can't use as much processing power, that you get this rolling shutter effect. When you're moving the camera, you get these wavy lines because the sensor can't be read by the processor as fast as in a full frame camera. I use my APS-C camera as a B camera in a lot of corporate shooting and a lot of interview style shooting, which doesn't have fast motion, so rolling shutter really isn't an issue. But if I was going to shoot a lot more fast motion stuff, sports, music videos, stuff like that, then I would definitely rely more on a full frame camera. And of course, we can't talk about any of the downsides of APS-C without talking about noise at higher ISO. Now, there are a lot of great tools out there that you can use to deal with noise at higher ISOs, and even the newer cameras that are coming out on the market have much better ISO performance than previous generation models because of new sensor designs. But there definitely is more noise at higher ISO on APS-C cameras than there is on full frame. And so if you're going to be shooting in a lot of really low light environments, then you're probably going to want to consider getting a full frame camera or getting a very fast or very wide aperture APS-C lens. There's the depth of field issue. Now, the depth of field issue, I don't think is as big a deal as a lot of people make it out to be, because you can deal with that by moving your subject and your background away from each other, or by using a really low f-stop or really high aperture lens like the Sigma 1.4 series for APS-C cameras, and your problem is pretty much solved. And kind of going along with that is the fact that you can't go as wide a field of view as you can on full frame. Now, I would say that that was true in years past, but now with new lenses coming on the market, like the Laowa 9mm or the Sigma 16, you can still get really great, really wide field of view photos with very little distortion on APS-C than you can on full frame. And that brings us to the downsides or the weaknesses of full frame, and the biggest of that has to be the expense. If you're going to buy this camera, which say you find on sale for $1,800 or so, this lens, which is one of the cheaper full frame lenses, is another $800 or $900, depending on what you find. This lens is another $900. So there in total, we have already spent $3,600 for a full frame camera and 2 lenses. For one full frame camera and 2 lenses, you could buy 2 complete APS-C size cameras and 2 lenses and have yourself a 2 camera setup for the same price, or maybe even a little bit less money than a single full frame camera with 2 lenses. Another downside that's not as much of an issue with mirrorless cameras as it is with DSLR cameras, which is what I used to shoot with, but it's the size and the weight. Full frame cameras are heavier and larger, and so they're going to take up more space in your camera bag, and if you're mobile like me, a lot of times that does become an issue. That being said, I still really like shooting on my full frame camera. But if you're traveling a lot, APS-C might be a better way to go because it's smaller and lighter. And then there's the fact that because you're covering a full frame sensor, you need larger lenses and larger glass elements to be able to get the image from the front of the camera to the sensor without distorting it and cover the entire sensor. And so that means that generally the lenses for full frame cameras are going to be considerably larger than their APS-C counterparts. And that can be a downside if you're having to pack and travel a lot and you want to take a few lenses with you. You're going to need a lot more room for the lenses and for the camera body itself. If you were to ask me today which one should you get, I would say unless you're going to do a lot of astrophotography or really low light photography and videography, then start with an APS-C camera. The A6400 is great, the A6100 is pretty good, the A6600 is fantastic, and the lens options available for them today are fantastic. Plus, you'll save yourself a lot of money in the beginning. Is an APS-C camera good enough for professional commercial work? Absolutely. I use mine in almost every shoot I do, and it works just as well as my A7RIII, except in a very few limited times. And then, even if you do decide that eventually you've hit the limitations of what your APS-C camera can provide and you need to jump into full frame, the best part is that you can use your APS-C camera as a B camera or a backup camera to your new full frame camera. One thing specific to Sony, their APS-C and their full frame line, is that you can use the lenses from full frame cameras on APS-C cameras, and you can even use APS-C lenses on their full frame cameras by using the APS-C mode in the camera. It does crop in 1.5 times because it's a smaller lens and it needs to, so that there's no massive vignetting around the edge. But the fact that you can interchange lenses between camera bodies makes this Sony E-mount system super versatile. Now, if you want to continue down this rabbit hole, maybe you don't believe me, you can click right here. I put together a playlist of other creators and other videos talking about APS-C versus full frame so that you can really understand this topic thoroughly. As always, if you have questions, let me know in the comments below or reach out to me on Instagram or Twitter. Cheers.